Hi, everybody. Welcome to the webinar, Harnessing and Measuring the Creative Potential of Social Design. I'm Jen Hawes, Partnership Manager for Island Press. Today's webinar brings together two leading experts on social design, Cheryl Heller and Anne LaFond. For the first time, Cheryl and Anne will share learnings from research supported by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation on how leading practitioners of social design are measuring the effectiveness of their work. Our webinar today is hosted by Island Press. Island Press is an environmental nonprofit book publisher. Founded in 1984, Island Press's mission is to provide the best ideas and information to those seeking to understand and protect the environment and create solutions to its complex problems. Island Press elevates voices of change, shines a spotlight on crucial issues, and focuses attention on sustainable solutions, like we're doing today with this free webinar presentation. I'd like to present our speakers to you. Cheryl Heller is the founding chair of the first MFA program in Design for Social Innovation at the School of Visual Arts in Manhattan. She is also president of the Design Lab at CommonWise. Cheryl is the recipient of the AIGA Medal for her contributions to the field and a Rockefeller Bellagio Fellowship. Her clients have included Ford Motor Company, American Express, Pfizer, Mars Corporation, Seventh Generation, L'Oreal, and the World Wildlife Fund. Cheryl has created the Ideas That Matter program for SAPI in 1999, which has given over $13 million to designers working for the public good. Her book, The Intergalactic Design Guide, was published by us here at Island Press. Anne K. LaFond, MSc, is the director of the John Snow Institute Center on Health Information Monitoring and Evaluation, or CHIME, and a senior evaluation specialist with a focus on MNCH and immunization programs, health systems performance, and development effectiveness. Anne has engaged with global health research, monitoring, evaluation and learning, MEL, and program design for 30 years to maximize the use of evidence and learning in addressing health challenges for people in low-income settings. She served as the senior advisor for research, monitoring, and evaluation in the Innovations for Maternal, Newborn, and Child Health Initiative, which focused on evaluation of social and behavior change innovations in Ghana, Kenya, and Sierra Leone. In this context, she has also led comparative case study research on the role of human-centered design, HCD, in MNCH developing the first influence pathway analysis of HCD. Anne is currently serving on the board of advisors for USAID and BMGF's HCD program Global Public Goods Initiative, collaborating on the development of the measured manual to guide investment in HCD and HCD measurement, and teaching M&E approaches at the School of Visual Arts MFA in Design for Social Innovation. Anne also specializes in strategic planning and health program design, including theory of change development and facilitating data use for improving health systems performance. Anne has worked for foundations, international NGOs, and technical assistance agencies, and has published on case study methods, health system sustainability, immunization acceptability, M&E system capacity building, and capacity measurement, and the acceptability of childhood immunization in Somalia. And with those introductions, I would like to hand this over to Cheryl to start the presentation.
Thank you, Jen, and thank you everyone for joining us. We just wanted to make sure you can recognize our voices. I am Cheryl Heller, and in addition to all those things that Jen just read, Anne and I have been working together for a number of years on some interesting projects, Measured being the most recent and the most exciting one.
Great, and I'm Anne LaFond. I'm delighted to be here, and thanks everyone for joining.
The genesis of all of this conversation and my relationship with Island Press is a book that I spent the last 3 years researching and writing. And the purpose of it was to capture the tacit knowledge and the practices from my life as a social designer, from my years as an educator, and now involved in this investigation of the relevance of social design. And the point of it was to simplify and codify what had been in lots of pieces and in lots of different places into one one place. And the title of the book comes from a quote by David Orr, the environmentalist, in a book called Earth in Mind. He said, as Homo sapiens' entry into any intergalactic design competition, industrial civilization would be tossed out at the qualifying round. He went on to say, it doesn't fit, it won't last, the scale is wrong, and even its apologists admit that it's not very pretty. The design failures of industrially, technologically driven societies are manifest in the loss of diversity of all kinds, destabilization of the Earth's biogeochemical cycles, pollution, soil erosion, ugliness, poverty, injustice, social decay, and economic instability. I read that quote by Orr about 15 years ago, and it was a really revelatory moment for me, because it struck me that he was making the statement that all of those things can be laid at the feet of design. And by the way, it's an understatement to say that things have not improved since he wrote that. Because what Orr is talking about is not just that, you know, education is broken or government is broken or we need to think differently about energy. He was saying that our entire civilization is a bad design. And when I first read it, I thought it was very extreme to blame all this design. But then as I started looking around, I realized that there was something to what he was saying, and I began to wonder whether design could play a role in changing things. If we look around, we see all that design does in unnecessary products with ill-conceived packaging headed straight to landfill. It's all around us. Design has been a very important part of our civilization. It's proven its value to businesses. It's proven that it can solve very serious human needs, and it's proven that it can create tremendous destruction and a lot of things that we don't need. The most traditional definition of design is the creation of something according to a plan. But what we realize as we look around and see the extent of the complicated issues we face is that no something is ever going to create the change we need, no matter how innovative it is. And plans don't work like they used to because of the complexity and the continual change that's happening all around us. John Ray, who was president of Schumacher College in the UK, said no one alive or in history would have planned to be where we are today as a species. And yet, going back to Orr, we have designed it. So now we're working on how to use design to change that. The definition of social design is the design of relationships, the creation of new social conditions intended to increase agency, creativity, equity, resilience, and connection to nature. And a really lovely way to think about those shifts comes from Fritjof Capra, when he's talking about systems thinking. He says it's from thinking of parts to wholes, from objects to relationships, from objective knowledge to contextual knowledge, from quantity to quality, from structure to process, from contents to patterns. That's the kind of shift we're talking about when we think about evolving from the traditional view of design, which is to use physical materials to construct something, even if it's bits and bytes, to this notion that the design process can be used to address amorphous and complex problems. One of the things we think about a lot is, where is social design appropriate? Where is it not appropriate? As a species, we've gotten really, really good at solving technical problems. Innovations in computing, communication platform and technology, AI and VR happen before anybody has a chance to notice they're needed. Innovations in clinical health, in energy and retail, hospitality, whatever, continually disrupt the status quo. So when problems can be defined concretely, and when they can be solved by a group of experts working in small teams or even vast open source ones, we excel at those linear sorts of projects. We are not good at all at solving complex problems. Our challenges like poverty, climate change, obesity, homelessness, crime, violence, the opioid addiction are all tangled and interconnected issue. And this requires us to function in chaos and ambiguity because these relationships are fluid and unpredictable. So we say that whenever human agency is a determinant of outcomes, traditional approaches don't work, and we need to look to new approaches, one of which is social design. What makes these challenges more daunting, of course, is that they're all interrelated, and the relationships between them turn them into wicked problems. So social design is relevant anytime human agency is a determinant of success. Social design is a complex system, and it has enormous variety in the places and ways it shows up, but it can be summarized as a system. And the system includes a set of principles. Some people call it a mindset. They are the values and the guardrails. It's like the operating system of how people practice this. There's a process in social design for getting from one point to another. And then there are a very specific set of skills that are required to do it. Instead of stages, and if you have seen typical innovation processes or creative processes, there are categories of activities. It will say immersion or research, and then ideation, and then implementation, or whatever it is. Instead of those stages, we've developed a process for social design that uses inquiry to drive momentum forward. There are a series of questions that direct action from initiation to outcomes and evaluation. And when they're completed in a thoughtful and a thorough way, each step provides a set of insights and forward momentum to the next, sort of a springboard for the next place we need to get to. In reality, of course, nothing is linear, and this process is circular, so it tends to keep repeating through different phases of a process. But the stages are fairly common. The skills that are required for social design are interesting ones, and it's a combination of hard skills or expert skills and power skills. Expert skills are the specific skills that any profession needs. It is, in data science, it's the ability to manipulate data. In architecture, it's the ability to develop 3D models, whatever that is. So, and in social design, there are endless variations of the sorts of expert skills that come together to address a problem. The interesting part is that the soft skills, or what I've been taught to call the power skills, are common to everyone in the team, and they're needed by everyone in the team. So capacity for critical thinking, for communication, for the creative process, for collaboration, those are things that everyone on the team has to have. And the success of a team is far less dependent on whether you have, too many or the right kinds of experts than it is with whether those people can collaborate, whether they can think together, and what their soft skills are. Another way to understand the process of social design is to think about it compared to the traditional process for innovating or for implementing anything, in which objectives are defined and research is done, and then a strategy is developed for doing it, and then it's tested, and then it's implemented. And what often happens, you're hearing a siren in New York City, sorry. What often happens is that those stages are done by different teams, and sometimes they don't overlap at all, so that people are completely different on the research team than they are on the testing team. Sometimes we find people develop the strategy and then they go research to prove what their idea was in the first place. So that's really antithetical to social design, which is based more on ideas that emerge from the process. In social design, these separate activities are collapsed and they're concurrent. There is a cross-disciplinary team that is involved all the way through, so that everyone is involved in researching and learning from the research, in making, which is prototyping, in observing what happens, and then planning the next step, so that these aren't sequential and separated, but that everyone sees what's happening and everyone can contribute ideas from their own unique perspective. And obviously that continues to repeat as well. Social design is not completely distinct from any other practice. It lives in lots of places, and in different disciplines there are components of this process that are practiced and have been practiced for a very long time. So part of what Anne and I are involved in with the project we're going to talk to you about in a minute is helping people understand where these overlapping practices are and how they can be implemented or integrated for best effect. There's a couple of stories that illustrate social design, and the first couple that I'm going to talk about are from the book. Eric Hersman is an extraordinary entrepreneur in Africa, and he is currently building routers that are the keystone enabler of the Internet of Things, but he's doing it in places where there's no internet and where there are actually very few things. He's doing it in countries with impossibly extreme weather, with no technological infrastructure, with systemic corruption, and no manufacturing capacity, no facilities, no parts, no way of shipping parts from one place to another easily. And in spite of this, he's well on his way to building the first billion-dollar African technology manufacturing company. He's done this because he's established a social infrastructure before he thought about the technological one. I'm not going into these in depth, but they are in the book if anybody wants to read them. Jeffrey Brown is another example, and all these examples are people who are doing what common wisdom in their industry or in their world said was impossible. Jeffrey Brown has built a $600 million successful grocery empire, selling highest quality suburban types of food to people in the poorest neighborhoods of Philadelphia. He's done that where no one else has succeeded, and he does it by constantly collaborating, consulting, and prototyping with the people in the neighborhoods where he's doing business. And finally, another example is Interface Carpet, which is the world's largest carpet tile company. I'm sure lots and lots of people know them. They were already a model for transformation to sustainability. And now they are creating economies in the Philippines and Cameroon, making 100% recycled carpet yarn from discarded fishing nets. They are starting banks in these communities. They're paying local people to collect the nets and clean them. And they figured out a way to add social value to their supply chain. They're doing this by a really interesting networked form of innovation across organizations. They're partnering with the Zoological Society of London across organizations and sectors. We are seeing really significant investment and optimism put into social design, whether people call it human-centered design or design thinking. It has become a novel and sort of the go-to approach when people want to break out of the status quo. There's enormous investment by philanthropies in it, businesses are invested in it, and that's showing up in a number of ways. Larry Fink last year, in his letter to shareholders, put out an edict and said that it is no longer enough for business to measure their success based on financial value only, that it's imperative that businesses contribute to society to create social value, or they will risk losing BlackRock's support. So that was a watershed moment. Anne talked about a project that is done in collaboration with the Gates Foundation and USAID. This is the homepage, and what we've been involved with is a resource for anyone working in public health to have tools and access and definitions and stories to tell and processes to adopt this way of working and use it around the world on public health. But we have found that no one has actually been successful, or perhaps been committed enough to look distinctly at what the contribution of design is in these issues. People measure outcomes, they measure health outcomes, they measure lots of other things, but looking at the difference that design makes, we have not found anyone who has answered that question. Anne is going to take over from here, but this provocative question about why don't designers tend to measure, I think the answer is we always measured on different dimensions, right? So if it's a product design, it would be measured against how many units it sold, or how much money it made for the company, or was the client happy. But we tend to discount the human aspects of it, much like other people involved in it have done.
And from an evaluator's perspective, we can understand why it's difficult to measure design, because it's not a well-documented process, and it's kind of slippery. If you ask designers, as we did when we conducted the case studies that are presented up here, we asked designers to tell us what are the metrics that you use to measure the effectiveness of design. How do you know that design has been successful? We got a lot of blank faces. A number of designers said, well, we're usually there at the beginning, but we're not there at the end. So it's sometimes hard to know the pathway from integrating design into a social sector program and seeing its influence all the way through that pathway. It's also difficult to measure because some of the relationships between the inputs and the processes of social design programs and the link to the outcomes are not always clear. In global health, which is the sector that I'm involved in with JSI, we're still exploring the right kind of pathways to achieving effectiveness, and integrating one more dimension, which is the influence of design, makes the measurement process complicated. So we actually spent a fair amount of time trying to understand and to tease out where design plays a role in global health when we conducted these case studies for the innovations for maternal, newborn, and child health that were done about 3 years ago. It's a project that was funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and implemented by Concern Worldwide, and JSI played the evaluation role. These case studies represent one of the first attempts to document the influence of design in global health, to really understand the process, its influence on the interventions and the practice of global health, and to try to explore the effect and contribution of design to global health outcomes. The studies are very in-depth. They aren't evaluations of design. They are really more exploratory and learning opportunities. And like many pieces of research, they left us with even more questions and additional needs to understand the influence of design in global health and in social sector generally, and really raised the question of how would you go about measuring design? How would you integrate measurement and design more effectively so that design can be grounded and in some cases somewhat more legitimized in the eyes of social sector planners and implementers. We want to understand going forward, what influence design has on framing problems, generating solutions, the rigor of the intervention. In the case studies, we even discovered that design itself had an effect on the behavior of the program managers. In fact, it was a very strong outcome. So in terms of having a transformative mindset and behavior change, design was very, very important in that case. But we want to understand how that actually happens. How does design help change practice? And again, going back to the issues of accountability, measurement will help, the global health world and the design world really understand what is effective design. How does one know if design has been done well? How does a global health funder or an implementer integrate design effectively into its practice and optimize its potential? So these are all burning issues, at least in how to harness the potential of design and use it alongside other strategies that we use to improve health. All these, sorry, led us up to the, I'm trying to advance. Can you advance the slide for me? Because mine isn't working. Okay, led us up to a summit called the Measured Summit, which was held in New York, hosted by Cheryl and her team at the School for Visual Arts. And Cheryl, maybe you could talk a bit about the Measured Summit.
Sure. It was our first exploration to see what the interest in the subject was and to bring vastly different people. This is Laurie Melichor from Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, but we brought people from small design firms, from giant foundations, from healthcare companies, from business, and we basically started a conversation to see what people were seeing and to see how far they had progressed in developing metrics for measuring the difference that design makes. And we heard resounding interest, as I said before, and we also heard that no one felt they had really come up with a method for accomplishing that.
So as a next step, what we did is we approached the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and said we would really like to explore this further. And we are into measured phase 2, which is a case exploration of actual practice of social design and exploring deeply where measurement, if measurement, has been integrated into the design process and what can we learn from that. We've canvassed a number of different cases and explored them and shortlisted a few of them. And we're developing an online resource to help share this information with the global health and the design community to try and help dig more deeply into this whole issue of social design and measurement. So these are the framing questions we used for each of the cases to really understand, what kind of social design was used in these cases. We asked the implementers, what makes this a good design? How does your approach in this case differ from similar approaches? And did it work really? And these were the dimensions of analysis that we used for each of the cases. And you can see second to the last at the bottom was really types and methods of measuring. And we did a deep dive, and we're still continuing to do a deep dive on measurement in these cases to really to document if measurement was integrated at all in the work that was going on, how it was used, and to what effect. On the measurement cases, we had 3 framing areas that we looked at. We asked whether measurement was used during the design process to inform the process and to test. We asked if measurement was used then to assess the effectiveness of the intervention in the end, more of a traditional program or impact evaluation. And we also wanted to know if there was any attempt to make that link between the use of design and the process and the outcome. So really looking at the influence, the effect of design. In our cases, the number 1 and number 2 were very easy for people to answer. There were more examples of measurement being done during the design process, especially to test during the prototyping stage. In some cases, there was an impact or a program evaluation that was done. Some organizations are poised and ready to do those kinds of end-line evaluations. But the third issue, this idea of trying to really understand that link between design and the outcome was really not anywhere to be seen. And it's still a big gap in the knowledge that we need to really understand where design makes a difference. Examples of some of the ways that measurement was used come from a case called Built for Zero, which is a case that's focusing on ending homelessness. These folks, they use design from the beginning to the middle to the end, and they made it a powerful tool for actually empowering communities and homeless people to be able to use data to actually continue to iterate on their problem solving. In another case where there were policing of poor communities, there was very little use of measurement at all, but a huge interest by the academic community to come in and see if the intervention was effective. So measurement was brought from the outside, but not used on the inside. So in exploring all of these cases, we're actually learning a bit more about how social design is taking place, how social sector measurement is being integrated with design, and really about where we can advise both the social sector practitioners and the evaluators to work more effectively together to make measurement part and parcel of what design is actually trying to do. You can see that from this slide that we are trying to compare here a kind of traditional approach to evaluation, which is where you take a baseline, you implement, and you take an end line, and you measure the impact at the end, with a much more design-influenced way of going about measurement, where you would actually design something, measure it, learn from it, and then iterate, and then do that cycle over and over again. And in the course of doing social design, the assumption is you would do this very much at the beginning of an intervention until you got to a point where you could scale. But it's, it's also possible to integrate the iterative type of measurement into regular programming. And we found that in several cases, these kinds of approaches have been, sorry, it's going the wrong way.
I'll drive for you. I'll drive.
Okay, this one.
You want to be there?
Keep going. Next one.
Okay. Okay.
So we found that you know, this idea of using measurement in an iterative way early on in a planning or a design process is found in other parallel environments and other processes like the adaptive management cycle and developmental evaluation, which are two practices that are being readily integrated into global health practice these days, where there's a greater interest in learning while doing, learning while implementing, taking one of the key principles of design perhaps, and which is iteration, and actually using that cycle to continue to hone an implementation and an investment process to better effect. So you're finding that the early examples of measurement during a design process has some parallels in the practice of development and social sector planning, but there are things to be learned from both schools, and we're trying to bring those two schools together and help them understand where the parallels are and where there's additional opportunities for collaboration and learning. You can do the next slide. Examples of how this translates into real world practice, you know, outside of the design world, are in quality improvement cycles or PDSA cycles, which many people are familiar with, where there's a plan, do, study, act process, iteration with data to try and learn and adapt. Next one. There are many different organizational management and learning kind of strategies for organizations. Many organizations are defining themselves as learning organizations and using data in an iterative way to try and hone their management or their practice. We in global health have used program learning on a routine basis to try and feed information back into our planning and our implementation processes. And the last one is this more iterative and adaptive program strategy, developmental evaluation, which is a very clearly defined and deliberative way of using evaluation, not just as a baseline and endline, but as a learning tool embedded in an implementation team and feeding into strategy over time.
We wanted to give you just a little sense of the cases that we're looking at and where we're extracting this learning. And they illustrate not only some really interesting projects, but they also illustrate how diverse the applications of this process are. This is a project, the Office of Economic Opportunity in New York City has founded a service design lab. And the mandate for this lab is not to come into the government with ideas for how things ought to be done. They are there to teach government agencies how to design better services, how to understand their constituents better, how to understand their needs better, and how to design services that are more accessible and more relevant to the citizens of New York who need them. Mass Design is an extraordinary architectural firm in Boston that has developed a process for including social value in the buildings it makes. This is a hospital in Haiti. It's the Jesquio Cholera Clinic that has built within it a water purification lab that hired local artisans to build the metal facade that helped a group of women who had never been worked together before to design custom furniture for the inside. So in everything they do, there's social value built in. Interestingly and surprisingly, in North Springfield, Massachusetts, some Green Berets, some former Green Beret brought back to this town, and Springfield has really significant issues, or had really significant issues with gang-related violence. They're adapting counterinsurgency techniques that they learned in Iraq and Afghanistan to this community, and it sort of turns policing on its head. So instead of arresting people who are breaking laws, these policemen are working with the community, building trust in the community and strengthening the community to protect itself and to defend itself against some of these things that are going on. FitWits is another very different example. It's a program developed in Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh that builds literacy around healthy diets and tries to shift behavior of children and their parents and teachers and school employees by using a very cohesively designed program of games and other sort of traditional design products, but used in a very systemic way. And then finally, Anne mentioned the project that is addressing homelessness. This is a program called Built for Zero, developed by Community Solutions. And they are working in about 75 communities across the country. They teach teams, diverse teams in these communities, how to solve problems of homelessness based on the realities and the conditions in their community, which are different in different parts of the country. And they have 10 communities have succeeded in getting to zero veterans in chronic homelessness. So those are just a few of the projects that we're looking at. And before we get to questions, we wanted to say that if anyone is interested in this project and partnering and either finding out more about the effectiveness of the approach you're using or some other way to partner, just let us know.
Great, thanks, Cheryl. If anyone has questions, we encourage you to put them into the questions box, and we will share them with the presenters, and they will answer them for you. We've still got about 20 minutes for that.
And Jen, did you want to talk about?
Sure, we can do this. Yep. Yep, absolutely. So we've got Cheryl's book here, The Intergalactic Design Guide. And for anyone here on the webinar, we'd like to offer you a special discount at 20% off. Just go onto the Island Press site, islandpress.org/social-design, and use 4Heller for your coupon code for 20% off. Anyone here. So again, feel free to share your questions.
All right. I think this may be a question for Anne, but we'll see. What is the best way to measure the outcomes of a project? Subjective or objective measures, qualitative or quantitative? Not sure one can generalize about that, Anne, but I'll let you take it.
Sure. No, I think it's a good question, and I think we can turn it back to actually posing the question. It depends what you want to know, right? I would say in our practice, we do more mixed methods analysis than ever before. There used to be a very strong interest in only looking at quantitative impact outcomes to understand the effectiveness of a program. But I think over the last 10 years, there's been an equally strong interest in not only understanding if a program has been successful or failed, but how and why that happened, so that if successful, the kind of process can be replicated or adapted elsewhere. And if the project actually did not succeed, what was learned from that, and how that others can prevent themselves from following the same patterns. So it's never an either or, and it's often stronger and more powerful to ask both the impact questions as well as the how and why success was achieved.
Here's a question. What are the biggest challenges of doing design in a global developing setting? And how are these challenges different from working on design projects in the US? Well, we probably both have answers to this. Obviously, as convoluted as our country can be, it's much easier working in places that we understand, that we know how they work. So I think for anyone working in a community that they know. But one of the really essential principles of social design is that we don't come in as experts to a place we don't know and dictate solutions. We don't import ideas. And so however it's done, the essential first step is to make sure that we have access to the people that will be affected by what we're doing. And this can be a very long process of identifying people in that location who have convening power, who have established trust in the community. And it's making sure that we have not only access, but we have understanding of the cultural issues and the other determinants that would affect the success of the project. And so in one sense, it's very much like, the difference doing anything in a place that one knows and one doesn't know. But there is always in social design an inviolate commitment to going in with an opening mind, to listening, to following threads of what is heard, and investigating issues that come up, because it's very much about being somewhere in the moment and paying attention to what's going on. Anne, do you want to answer that from your perspective?
Sure, and going maybe from the principles to the practical, the kind of things that we observed in the case studies that we conducted were a need to adapt some of the more traditional design techniques to the population that you're working with. It may be linguistic adaptations, but also there was a need to adapt to non-literate populations. So working with traditional birth attendants in Sierra Leone, the concern team had to develop their own techniques of working with images and actions rather than written words and other techniques to be able to work with these women and to help bring out their understanding and their viewpoints and gain insights about their work settings and how they were transforming their work from being midwives to being health promoters. So there was, like in many other cases, there's a need to adapt to the populations that you're working with. I think another challenge is on a higher level, on a maybe an overall kind of system level, is helping decision makers, for example, in a health system in a country, understand what design intends to do and how it is different or advantageous to use design for certain challenges than to use other techniques or to use it in combination. We've worked with developing country governments that have asked us for a lot more in-depth understanding about design. What is the design process? Why would you use it? Why are you asking people all of these questions and raising their expectations? And really trying to help bring a human-centered set of questions and answers to public sector decision making. Those are some of the challenges that we've faced, is really thinking of how do you explain design to public sector institutions and decision makers, and then also adapting it to the populations that you want to understand.
I think that points out, there's enormous responsibility involved in any of this work, because we do come into situations that we don't know. We do witness dynamics, and we can have anyone who intervenes in any way can have an effect way beyond what's expected. So there's it's really important to be aware of the impact that, as Anne was saying, even questioning someone. We're working on a project in the US looking at how to diminish the flow of young people from foster care to homelessness. And we're really careful about the way in which we come to understand the dynamics, not from our point of view or not based on something that we've read, but what is it really like to be a young person facing the kinds of decisions and facing the kinds of trauma that can determine whether one goes on to have a healthy, independent life or whether one experiences homelessness. How do you distinguish social design from human-centered design? Do you believe they are one and the same? Why or why not? A human-centered approach is at the center, I meant that pun, of all of this work. And so in the health sector, HCD, or human-centered design, tends to be the expression used. It is a core component of social design, but I look at social design as being a broader application that, of course, it is human-centered, but there are lots of other factors. It isn't always only humans at the center of it. There's often more than one audience. And so my perspective is that social design is a broader category and includes human-centered design. But the fact of the matter is, one of the challenges we face, or, this isn't just true of our world, but there's different terminology used for the same thing. There's the same terminology used for different things, and it can be confusing. And so we're building into the Measured project a glossary of vocabulary to help people navigate, because it isn't always completely clear. I'll read this and then we can decide. In your opinion, does attempting to scale the impact of design sometimes work against the idea of place-based efforts to affect positive change locally. Follow-up, how can scaling impactive design and maintaining effective local intervention coexist? One important way to think about this is that what is scaled is the process, and what remains consistent is the process. And part of the process includes real immersion and understanding of the place. And so you don't necessarily, in a cookie cutter way, apply a solution that worked in one place to another, but you also don't start from zero. And it is this methodology for learning about a place, for for working with the communities there, that scales, and the learning about how that process adapted and what worked about the process and what didn't continues to be refined as you take it from one place to another.
Yes, and if I can pick up on that a little bit from the example I gave from the innovations case study, the program managers that were actually involved in the design process, a number of them reported out that it changed the way that they viewed the work that they were doing, and how the being more human-centered, going back and iterating and co-creating with these end users, as they called them, was a very powerful tool that they would then integrate into practice going forward, not just for that particular project, but really thinking about how they engaged in the future, in thinking about framing problems and working with people to develop solutions using these techniques. And in that way, as Cheryl said, it's the kind of iterative process that gets scaled. It's the primacy of being human-centered coming into play, not being dwarfed by all of the other practical things that go into program planning or to scaling, and trying to keep that human-centered lens out in the forefront as you go forward. I think in terms of scaling particular products or particular interventions, it would still be done in a way that allows you to continue to adapt them if they're taking off in a certain setting. You would still continue to adapt them to different settings and different, without having to go back and restart the design process all over again. Scaling can be just a kind of iterative tailoring of different kinds of interventions to different settings.
For iterative evaluations, please tell me if it's been feasible to do measurement almost concurrently for impact. My understanding is that we need at least some minimum time period before evaluations can be carried out meaningfully.
Yes, I think we struggle with that challenge of trying to do impact evaluation and at the same time watching a program iterate and using more of a developmental evaluation approach while the implementation was taking place. And it does put the principles of pure impact evaluation and evaluation and research design up against the wall, because it's not what evaluators have been trained to do, which is to really hold things constant so that you can study an intervention as if it were in a laboratory setting. I think what we're finding is that those rigorous evaluation techniques are useful for answering questions that are more about a result that you are really testing, a result or an intervention that you've actually honed through some kind of developmental evaluation process, and then you really want to go and ask yourselves, is it impactful? So I would think the combination of impact evaluation and developmental evaluation can take place, but if you're really trying to actually do a proof of concept at the end, you would want impact evaluation, not a more iterative evaluation. Again, it depends on what question you're trying to answer, and using the right kind of measurement technique at the right time to be able to further either your exploration and learning and honing in on interventions that you believe are showing promise and are showing effectiveness, and then taking those interventions and putting them into a more impact evaluation setting, and then testing them in a more rigorous way. So I would see it as a kind of continuum of different kinds of measurement that's needed, depending on the question that you're asking.
Here's one. I'm curious about how social design relates to SVA. Would you say social design has a necessary visual component, or is the relationship merely happenstance? No, it's not happenstance at all, this relationship. Well, I'll answer those questions separately. Social design is absolutely the process, and often the outputs absolutely rely on visual communication and visual deliverables. Looking strictly at social design, one of the set of skills that designers bring to this process that aren't necessarily available in other disciplines is the ability to visualize abstract ideas and to help people align around reality and what current reality looks like, right? So mapping an ecosystem or visualizing some data in a way that makes it real for people. This is a huge tool. So there are visual aspects of this social design process. In addition, there are often artifacts that are made as part of this process, so that, you know, there might be, you know, things as simple as a manual or things as complex as you know, a big program or a website, but they're absolutely components of what's made in this process that are visual. The difference is that instead of being standalone projects, right? So there is not such a thing as a component of social design where the goal is to make a poster, which can happen in traditional forms of design. These artifacts and these skills are always in service to a larger system and always in service to a particular outcome. The way that this program ended up at SVA is that my dear friend Richard Wild, who chairs the undergraduate design and advertising programs, talked me into teaching and said, why don't you develop a class that interests you? And what interested me was why design education teaches tools and skills and self-expression, but never teaches how that interacts with the outside world. And so I developed a program in his undergraduate course in his undergraduate program. And after a couple of years, SVA said, what would that look like as a graduate program? And I said, I don't know. And that's how we ended up here. Are there best practices for measuring, i.e. impressions, when you're working to, for example, increase community cohesiveness? Anne, do you want to take that?
Sure. I'm not sure I quite understand the question, but I'll give it a go. When you say impressions, I assuming you're talking about qualitative information that you're learning from the subjects that you're studying. I'm just reading the rest of the question. Is that it? For example, I work for an organization that works on immigrant inclusion in a Rust Belt city. What we often struggle with measuring is how the information we put into the community and the events we hold might have a positive impact on someone's relationship to their foreign-born neighbors or their impression of immigrants in general. So you're asking, you're measuring people's responsiveness to the information that you're sharing, and whether it's changing the way that they're framing their impressions of their neighbors. I mean, I know that there are measurement techniques trying to understand how people interpret different kinds of communication materials and what they're taking away from them, and whether it actually changes their perceptions or behaviors. It's when you say it's impressions, I'm thinking that you're meaning perceptions, and then perhaps leading to attitudes and then to behaviors. So yes, there are measurement and evaluation techniques that are looking at different ways of affecting people's behavior through changing their understanding, knowledge, attitudes, and practices. There are both qualitative and quantitative metrics that you can use and approaches that you can take.
All right. We would like to thank you. Our time is up, and hope that this has been interesting and useful for everyone. And we're always happy to meet people who feel like coming back to graduate school and becoming a change leader and a social designer. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks everybody for your time. Thanks everybody for your time. We're going to send the recording out, so you'll see that. And I appreciate the presenters here today and all of the people who attended. So everyone have a great day, and thank you so much.